Welcome back to our Obscure and Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg series. As always, a link to the previous episode and to the iceberg itself will be included in the description. I would also like to give thanks to our channel members. I know I thank you in almost every video, but I really do appreciate y'all. If you're not a member and would like to become one, click the join button, or help support the channel by making sure you're subscribed. And lastly, I would like to thank Aura for sponsoring this video. Now, more than ever, it's really important to talk about protecting your identity, because hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which provides information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others who perform background checks. This includes your full name, your date of birth, your address, social security number, and even any alternate names you may go by. And to make it worse, some of the members of the hacking group have reportedly been releasing this information for free online. If you weren't taking precautions to secure your personal data, then this should be a huge wake-up call, because you've never been more vulnerable than right now. When I first heard of this, I was terrified, but then I remembered that I use Aura, which made me feel a lot better, because I knew that if my information was included in the breach, that they were already working hard to remove it and to protect me. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security on the dark web. They quickly notify me if anyone has tried to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. And, in the worst case scenario that somebody does steal my identity, their identity theft insurance will give me up to $5 million. They also provide a bunch of other features that help keep you safe online, all within a single app. You can use my link, aura.com/coldcoffin, to try it for free for 14 days. Which is enough time for Aura to find out if your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend that you do this right now, because not only is national public data not going to do anything to help you, they probably won't even face any repercussions for this leak. I'm not leaving myself or my family vulnerable, and if you don't want to either, go to aura.com/coldcoffin to try it risk-free for 2 whole weeks. And now, back to the video. And now that that's out the way, it's time to dive into the second half of Tier 4. Guglielmo Marconi was an Italian inventor during the late 1800s, and is even credited as being the grandfather of Wi-Fi for his work in wireless telegraphy. Marconi was also the man who created the first truly wireless radio, and has been likened to that of the famous inventor Nikola Tesla. But one of the things he's most famous for was his concern over the creation of a death ray. During the late 1800s, scientists began researching electromagnetic waves. The idea was first theorized by a man named James Maxwell in 1867, but it wouldn't be until 20 years later that Heinrich Hertz was able to prove the theory and generate electromagnetic waves in his lab. This being a new discovery at the time meant that all kinds of new technologies could be developed with the use of these waves. But perhaps the most revolutionary technology at the time was that of the wireless radio. The exact date is not clear, but it's believed Marconi built his first radio somewhere around 1894 or 1895. Going into the early 1900s, Marconi had set up his yacht, the Elettra, to be his laboratory on the water, where he conducted many of his experiments. And it is here that Marconi would have a, quote, interesting discussion with a man named Aldelmo Landini, who was Marconi's radio operator on the Elettra. In his book, titled 5 Years on Board the Elettra with Marconi, Landini would talk about a conversation he had with Marconi himself. I am sure there must be in the middle of the frequency spectrum a frequency able to kill more or less rapidly a particular microorganism. A well-defined frequency, as many frequencies as the number of microbes, in short, enough to resolve the diseases of man, animals, and plants. While this does not outrightly speak of the death ray, we can see the fundamental idea begin to manifest. But Marconi was not the only person to conceptualize such a deadly device. English inventor Harry Grindle Matthews would go as far as to claim that he had actually invented a death ray in the 1920s. His device used electricity, but his claims were met with a lot of skepticism, despite demonstrating his device to some journalists as well as government officials. Many were suspicious that Matthews was using trickery or some sort of confidence game. Eventually, after much back and forth between multiple governments, Matthews claimed that he had sold the death ray to the United States, but would not disclose the amount he had gotten paid for it, or to who exactly, and no proof of this device's existence would ever make it into the public. Not only that, Nikola Tesla would say this in a quote from the 1937 article, "A machine to end war. None of my inventions contemplate the use of any so-called death rays. Rays are not applicable because they cannot be produced in the requisite quantities and diminish rapidly in intensity with distance. All the energy of New York City, approximately 2 million horsepower, transformed into rays and projected 20 miles, could not kill a human being, because according to a well-known law of physics, it would disperse to such an extent as to be ineffectual. My apparatus projects particles, which may be relatively large or of microscopic dimensions, enabling us to convey to a small area at a great distance trillions of times more energy than is possible with rays of any kind. Many thousands of horsepower can thus be transmitted by a stream thinner than a hair, so that nothing can resist it." Despite stating that waves cannot be used to create such a device, the outright mention of a death ray is interesting. It's clear that the idea of such a device was thought of by some of the world's greatest inventors. In the case of Nikola Tesla, despite some of his inventions being wildly imaginative, many were very real. And if we look at present-day devices such as particle accelerators, which are able to take particles and smash them together with a force strong enough to replicate the conditions that immediately followed that of the Big Bang, Tesla's particle beam death ray seems a lot more achievable. In this published article, author Carlo Artemi cites the biography of Rachelle Mussolini, wife of the Italian ruler Benito Mussolini, where she claims Marconi possessed a device with the power to paralyze aircraft and cars through the use of concentrated microwaves. I was not able to find a copy of the biography online to validate this, but I did find this newspaper article from 1935, where they talk about Marconi using microwave radiation to stop the engines of planes and cars, like Rachelle Mussolini had allegedly claimed in her book. But some believe that this claim could have potentially been propaganda used to strengthen Mussolini's rule, by making it appear as though Italy had possessed weapons far more technologically superior than the rest of the world. And Marconi not only got the attention of other scientists. In the 1930s, Pope Pius invited Marconi to the Vatican to set up the Vatican radio. Here, he also conducted many experiments using microwaves, but all of this would end in 1937, when Marconi passed away at the age of 63. It's stated that 3 days before his death, Marconi met with the Pope, though what they spoke of was never disclosed. It's also stated that a few hours before he passed away, Marconi spoke with his doctor, Dr. Pozzi, and spoke to him about, quote, "some things that only you must know," which Dr. Pozzi took with him to the grave. 8 years later in the book, Mussolini Confesses to the Stars, Mussolini would claim that Marconi had proposed the death ray to him, but was advised against building it by the Pope due to the destruction it would bring. But again, the validity of this is debated on because of Mussolini's strong propaganda campaigns. In the end, no device was ever made public, but I find the Mussolini claims the most interesting. On one hand, we have newspaper articles stating that a device was already created and was even used to stop multiple types of vehicles, and on the other, we have Mussolini claiming in a book that Marconi was advised against building such a device, further muddying the water. Like Nikola Tesla, Marconi may have been way ahead of his time, and while I don't believe he had fully perfected a device such as a death ray, I believe he may have at the very least experimented with, or developed something close, that made him fearful of its completion. With where we're at with technology right now, it's very possible that such a device may already exist. Before we get into this section, I would like to warn you that we will be talking about, in YouTube terms, unaliving oneself. So, if that is something you're uncomfortable with, I understand, and you may skip ahead to the next section of the video. Let's start at the beginning. Chris McKinstry was a Canadian-born computer scientist who by age 17 had become a millionaire after creating a copyright software and licensing it to large companies, as seen in this article right here. Chris has been recognized for his work in the AI field, but despite his success, he did experience very low points. At age 23 in 1990, Chris and his then-girlfriend had broken up, and he was taking it pretty hard. As reported in this documentary, The Man Behind the Curtain, Chris had gone to the hospital to tell them that he wanted to end his life, but the hospital staff did not take him seriously and sent him away to battle his demons alone. After this, he went to a local gun shop, where after asking the worker if he could check out some of the firearms, he proceeded to insert rounds of ammunition into said firearms, leading to a standoff with police. An archived Google group message contains a copy of the article sent by a user back in late January 2006. Police capture armed man. Tear gas ends a 7.5-hour standoff at downtown gun shop by Robert Steiner. Toronto. A 23-year-old armed man was captured last night by the Police Emergency Task Force after a 7.5-hour standoff at a downtown gun shop. Police sprayed the Yonge Street gun shop with tear gas and entered it wearing gas masks at 9:45 p.m. They discovered a man in the basement next to 2 loaded rifles. The man, conscious and uninjured, was taken to the hospital. He was hiding in the basement with 2 armed rifles. Staff Inspector Robert Molyneux told reporters moments after the capture. We had seen him moving around the store with weapons and a metal helmet before he disappeared from our view. During the 5 hours of negotiations, the man told police he had problems with his girlfriend and was considering suicide. The police negotiator, Staff Sergeant Terry Kelly, said he was intending to commit suicide. The man entered Nick's sports shop near Wesley Street at about 2 p.m. yesterday, where he grabbed a handgun from the shop owner. The staff and customers fled. Emergency Task Force officers crouched in doorways on either side of the shop. Officers working from a command post near a subway station quickly established communication with the gunman and tried to persuade him to give himself up. Later, the man's girlfriend and male friend were brought in, Detective Sergeant Lou Villani said. Shortly before 8 p.m., the man ripped out the phone cord and disappeared from view. Police said they didn't know whether he was still conscious or even alive. He could have passed out, or he could have passed away, said Staff Sergeant Mike Sale after contact with the man was lost. Time is of the essence now. We must go inside and see how he is. Before releasing tear gas, police sent a Fox robot into the store. The machine was operated by a bomb disposal unit and equipped with a video camera and stun gas. The gas would have been triggered if the robot had been attacked. After 15 minutes, when the robot found nothing on the store's first floor, police sprayed the store with tear gas and sent in emergency task force officers. Police identified the man in custody as Chris McKinstry. Such an event would be considered life-ruining by many, but not Chris. Because he had previously gone to the hospital pleading for help before the standoff, Chris was not criminally charged, and friends of his would even say that the event actually motivated him in his career. 6 years later, Chris would begin producing an internet soap opera called CR6.
CR6 is our showcase interactive clickable reality. It's a internet-based soap opera, for lack of a better term. It's actually darker than a soap opera.
According to this now deleted Redditor who did great work trying to find CR6 on the Lost Media sub, production of the show began in 1996, and Chris had put over $1 million into it. But production fell through after it was reported by crew that Chris was incredibly hard to work with. He would be described as a narcissist, bipolar, and even too smart for his own good. Chris ultimately sold the rights to CR6 for $1 to the production staff, but there were still complaints that everyone who worked on the show was left unpaid. Unfortunately for them, Chris ended up moving to Santiago, Chile, and alienating himself from almost everybody who knew him. There are even archived Google group messages from October 1999, where he defends himself from people calling him a scammer. So the story goes, McKinstry ripped off people and ended up in Chile, where he spent the last few years hiding. but he was seen by myself this past June having lunch at the Olive Garden on Portage across from Polo Park. Chris would reply with, 1. I haven't been in Canada since August 18, 1997, though I still do maintain substantial assets there. 2. I wouldn't be caught dead in an Olive Garden. 3. I've had extensive plastic surgery, so you couldn't recognize me anyways. And as for the primary question, CR6 was sold to the cast in June of 1997 for $1. They own all the rights to trademarks, story, characters, and production software. As for people getting ripped off, no one lost money, other than me, depending on how you count about 1 million, contrary to the reports here and in the media. Now, even though Chris was in Chile, he did continue to work on his AI projects. Though according to some of his colleagues, what he claimed about his projects was often exaggerated. MindPixel, for example, which launched in 2000, was portrayed to be the foundation to an AI neural network by Chris, but was at its core simply a database of true or false questions based off of the answers provided to it. Unfortunately for Chris, 5 years after the launch of MindPixel, the project came to an end. Throughout all of this time, Chris had battled with the thoughts of taking his own life. There were occasions where people close to him would have to talk him down from the ledge, so to speak, and many close calls. A notable accident happened on January 20th of 2006, where Chris ingested a large amount of prescription medication and posted that he was going to spend his final moments at an internet cafe in Chile online. But thankfully, after noticing something was wrong with him, the staff at the cafe called emergency services, and he was quickly taken to the hospital to be treated. You can still find the whole thread on the Wayback Machine, and read through the interactions he was having as the drugs began to run their course. The final message he posted went like this: I overdosed in 1997 and spent weeks in intensive care on vitamin K because my blood would not clot, and I did severe liver damage, which is why I do not drink now. If you must know, I am feeling really impaired. And yes, time will tell what happens to me. I really have to get out of here. I cannot type, and want to vomit. Time to go hide. 3 days later, on January 23rd, Chris was found deceased in his Chilean apartment. He had put a plastic bag over his head and attached the tube from his stove into the mask, using the gas to end his life. And this is where things get a bit conspiratorial. Chris wasn't necessarily liked by everybody, and so when news of his passing began to spread, not everybody was buying it. Blame It on George made a great video about his hunt for the CR6 lost media, which I recommend watching if you'd like to learn more about the CR6 show. Blame It on George actually contacted our now deleted OP in this CR6 post, and it is during their search that they appear to stumble upon evidence that Chris might actually be alive. One of the issues is that Chilean records of Chris's death are hard to come by. Internet sleuths have attempted to pull up his death certificate by using his Chilean national ID number, which is available online, and putting it into the civil registry, only to get back this message. Dear user, the data you entered does not meet the requisites to issue this certificate, which according to this user on the r/Chile sub is the result you receive when you enter a living person's number. But even more interesting is the find that was made by the OP in Blame It on George's video. This person alleges that they were on Chris McKinstry's Wikipedia page, snooping around the edit history when they found what appeared to be some back and forth on whether or not Chris's body was extradited to his family in Canada. In particular, there was a single user whose wiki edit history was only edits to Chris's wiki page. This account here, with the username Kogolofino, it was created on January 24th, 2006, one day after Chris was reportedly found deceased. In Blame It on George's video, the OP alleges that they had managed to acquire this person's IP address, and when they traced it, it came back to Santiago, Chile, the same place that Chris was living at when he passed away. I attempted to do this myself, but the wiki profile has now been deleted, so I was not able to confirm if this is true. If this is true, then I could see why some people would think this is Chris. Assuming he did fake his own death, then confirmation that his body was extradited to his family would help solidify his story as opposed to not knowing where his body ended up. But as of the time of this recording, there's no mention of Chris's body anywhere on his Wikipedia page. The OP also points out something else. If you Google Chris McKinstry's name in the Google group messages, you can find this post from a person with Chris's name. The person speaks as though they are Chris, but in my opinion it seems as though this person is making fun of Chris, and not him posting after his alleged fake death. If we lean into the conspiracies for a little bit, I think he could have had reasons to fake his death. We know that at the very least he had lost around $1 million, and he allegedly owed cast members from the CR6 show. With that and MindPixel shutting down, it's reasonable to assume that he could have owed a lot of people money, and faking his death could have helped free him from that debt, as we've seen others attempt to do before. Throw in the missing death certificate and Wikipedia account, and things begin to look a bit fishy. Personally, I don't know what to believe. Chris undoubtedly struggled with his mental health, and that is not something to just discard, so let me know what you think down in the comments. Before we move on to the next topic, I would like to give a shout out to these two videos. If you'd like to learn more about Chris as well as his CR6 show, I highly recommend watching them. Both were a huge source of information for me, and each provide more details than I was able to fit into this segment. April 1851. About 90 miles off the coast of St. John's in Newfoundland, crew aboard the brig Renovation reportedly witnessed what they described as an iceberg estimated to be around 5 miles long and 30 to 40 feet high. Sitting in this iceberg were two ships, frozen stuck. The smaller of the two ships was placed higher up in the iceberg and appeared to be in good condition, but the larger ship looked to be on its side, and parts of it were practically destroyed. The sole passenger of the ship, a man named John Lynch, had urged the crew to go investigate, but unfortunately at the time, the captain of the ship, Captain Coward, was very sick and had a man named Robert Simpson take command. Despite Simpson going down to inform Captain Coward about the discovery, he did not receive permission to go investigate, and so the Renovation sailed away, leaving the two ships behind. Captain Coward was quoted in an interview conducted by the Admiralty. When asked if he would have been able to identify any living beings on the frozen ships, Captain Coward said this: "If any living being had been moving about the decks, we could have easily have distinguished them with the glass. When I first saw the ships, I believed them to be the two Greenland abandoned, and such is my impression to this day. I was ill at the time, and the ship was surrounded by icebergs, and I was anxious to get away while the weather was clear. No mention was made at the time, nor did the idea enter my head that these ships might be Sir John Franklin's ships. This supposition was first mentioned before me next day in convention with Mr. Lynch and the mate, Mr. Simpson. None of the crew who were with me at the time are now on board the Renovation, excepting two apprentices. The second mate, Andrew Bell, and the rest of the crew deserted at Quebec." Captain Coward mentioned Sir John Franklin's expedition, which consisted of the two ships, Erebus and Terror, that had gone missing a few years prior. At the time, there was a large reward for anybody who could find these ships, and it's reported that John Lynch had been aware of this, and that this is why he pressed the crew to go investigate. But as we can see, Captain Coward and his crew were not aware of this reward, and so did not press their sighting any further, but all of it was recorded in the ship's records. This was also reported to the Admiralty, but did not receive much attention until a letter written by John Lynch was published in the newspaper. Around the whole year after the initial sighting, and once the story had become popular, the report finally made its way to the Admiralty, who began investigating this. They sent officials to interview witnesses, where they found that everybody's stories lined up. They also found that a separate German ship had reported the sight as well. And in June of 1852, the Admiralty published a report titled Vessels in the North Atlantic. This is where they provided all of their investigation findings through various interviews and letters. After reading it, you can see the level of investigation as well as the process of the investigation as it develops. The Admiralty interviews crew members and even people who were close to the crew in order to determine if they could be trusted. After tracking down Robert Simpson, who was now the captain of another ship, the British Queen, He confirms that the crew had no idea that these ships could have been the Erebus and Terror. He also points out that the ships they spotted were painted black, and interestingly enough, the Terror and Erebus were also painted black on the outside. But despite their investigation, it does not appear that the Admiralty came to a solid conclusion. They seem to believe that the two ships in the ice were not the Erebus or the Terror, but instead likely merchant ships due to their large size. Later in 1859, a letter known as the Victory Point Note was discovered. On the edges of an Admiralty form was a handwritten message informing the reader that the two ships, Erebus and Terror, had been abandoned on April 22, 1848, after being stuck in ice since September 12, 1846. This timeline of events lines up too well with that of the renovation sighting in 1851, only around 2 years after the Terror and Erebus were reportedly abandoned. So could the Admiralty have been wrong in their investigation? Eventually, in 2014 and 16, both the Erebus and Terror would be found in the Queen Maud Gulf, but from what I can tell, their discovery was not able to confirm or deny if these were the ships that the renovation crew had spotted. If they were the ships, then they would have had to float a significant distance to end up where they were found, leaving us no closer to the answers of which ships it was that the renovation brig saw. Perhaps had the Admiralty discovered the Victory Point Note earlier in their investigation, things could have gone a lot differently. No other ships have ever come as close as these, as being the ones identified as being stuck in the iceberg. But with the ocean's tendency to swallow up its victims, it's likely we will never find out. The Roswell incident is likely the most famous UFO sighting of all time, but there is one aspect of the story that seems to be forgotten about, or maybe even suppressed. The original incident happened in 1947, and as reported by the US military, was the result of a weather balloon crash. Initial reports from the newspaper at that time claimed that a flying disc had crashed down to Earth, but we're not focusing on the crash itself. We're focusing on a witness that ended up paying the ultimate price. Her name was Miriam Bush. According to reports, Miriam was the executive secretary to Chief Medical Officer Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren in the Roswell Military Hospital. As the story goes, one day Miriam came home from work to tell her family about something she had seen that day. She was in a very happy mood and seemed excited. She went on to tell her family that her supervisor had asked her to go with him to a hospital room, where she saw the bodies of several childlike beings. She described them as having very large heads, small bodies, and pale, the usual gray alien description. According to Miriam, the smell was terrible, and all of the beings except for one appeared to be dead. It's fair to assume that her family was shocked at hearing this, but things would get even stranger the next day when Miriam returned from work. Only this time, her attitude was completely different. This time, Miriam appeared frightened. She told her family that they could never speak to anybody about what she had told them the night before, and as time would pass, she became increasingly paranoid. The paranoia ended up taking over Miriam's life. She became an alcoholic, a shut-in, and moved away to California, barely speaking to her family anymore. There are some reports that she believed she was being watched, and that listening devices were being placed to spy on her. All of this would come to a head in 1989, when Miriam checked herself into a hotel under her sister's name, and it is in this hotel that she was later found with a plastic bag tied over her head, deceased. According to her sister-in-law Pat Bush, who was interviewed in a documentary about Roswell witnesses, Miriam's body had shown signs of bruising, as if there was a struggle, but despite this, police would rule it as a suicide. I also read that during this time there were Roswell investigators who were looking for Miriam so that they could interview her about what she had seen, and that after hearing this, Miriam grew even more worried, either because these people were the ones she was hiding from the whole time, or because they might lead those people to her. The first thing I did to try to validate this story was of course look up Miriam's name, where I found this ancestry census record from 1940. It lists a 14-year-old girl named Miriam Andrea Bush, who lived in Roswell. The only problem is that this census was 7 years before the crash, meaning that this medium would have been around 21 when she was the executive secretary of the hospital in the military base, something that is not impossible by any means. But if we're talking about a high-level military base, I would expect everybody to be a bit older or more seasoned. Again, not impossible, but something to consider. I also tried to find records of her superior, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren, but found nothing other than mentions of him in recounts of Miriam's story. And then there's the man named Glenn Dennis, who was a mortician that claimed he spoke to a nurse, which drew a picture of the beings on a napkin. The nurse has been theorized to have been Miriam, but Glenn's claims have been picked apart by many people who believe he was just lying to get attention. There is this YouTube channel that posted interviews from what appears to be a documentary about Roswell witnesses who were originally afraid to tell their stories. This is where I found Pat Bush's interview. In the descriptions of each of these videos is a link to the Sci-Fi Network website, where the show's information was located, but the original page is gone, even on the Wayback Machine. I looked all over the place to try to find any clips from this show but was unsuccessful. I did, however, find this blog post, which also links back to the now empty Sci-Fi page, so that at least helps validate this show's existence or promotion of the show. But I do wonder why Sci-Fi decided to completely erase this from their catalog. It's not even listed in the announced but unrealized section. From what I've gathered, I believe it was supposed to release somewhere around 2007, this being because the YouTube uploads and the blog where I found the image were both dated back to 2007. In her interview, Pat Bush speaks about Miriam and basically confirms what we know of the story so far. But she also claims that in the family's search for answers about Miriam's death, they investigated other witnesses, and many of them had also passed away due to mysterious circumstances. She states that she does not believe Miriam took her own life, and that something big was being covered up. The full interview will be linked in the source list if you would like to check it and the other 4 out. If we assume that all of this is real, and that Miriam was being monitored, then it would make sense that there are no records of her or other military personnel who witnessed these events and worked on the base. I've read many stories about how witnesses to extraterrestrial phenomenon become afraid, paranoid that people are now looking for them, watching them, and listening to everything. This would fit very well with what Miriam was going through. She had already spilled the beans, and could have been fearful of the consequences for telling her family. With so little information, this is where the story ends. But nowadays, the government seems to be more open with sharing information about events like these, so maybe in time, they might declassify more of the Roswell files and shed some light on Miriam's story. In 1934 Pirano, reports of a glowing woman started buzzing in a local hospital. The woman was a then 42-year-old Ana Monaro, and she had been at the hospital for an unrelated treatment. But after staff witnessed what they described as luminous emissions coming off of Ana, doctors wanted to look into this further. Thankfully, she agreed to be part of a study. And so a team of doctors, as well as a neuropsychiatrist and a physicist, began looking into Ana's glowing phenomenon. It was the physicist Giogondo Proti who wrote about the experiments in this article that was published in the Illustrated London News. According to the article, the study consisted of various tests, ranging from a routine medical examination, X-rays, recordings on supersensitive film, and the use of instruments capable of detecting and measuring electric currents. The researchers even built a Faraday cage, which is essentially a box that blocks out external electromagnetic fields to prevent the possibility of this being caused by some outside force. But it was on April 11th that the researchers recorded and measured Ana's mysterious glow. She had been recorded to glow for a little over 3 seconds, and this was captured on the supersensitive film. Here is an image of the actual film that was used to record Ana's glowing. You can see how the intensity of the glow slowly increases until it dies down and fades away. During the event, Ana's heart rate and breathing had also increased, as shown on this graph from before and after she began to glow. During the experiment, the researchers found that whether she was inside the Faraday cage or not, had practically no difference in her electroscopic charge read by the instruments. They also didn't find any evidence of this being a form of radiation being emitted off of her. But something interesting that they did notice was that Anna's glow would intensify during Lent, and while she was in prayer. They theorized that her fasting during Lent could play a role in the glow, due to the lack of food affecting her body chemistry. It was ultimately ruled that the cause of the glow must have been some sort of biochemical reaction, similar to how some organisms are able to produce a bioluminescent glow. The doctors examined her brain, heart, and the radiating power of her blood. They found that her heart and brain were relatively normal, but her blood had a higher level of radiating power than that of the average person. Because of this, it was theorized that when Anna would fast, whatever was in her blood that they believe could have been sulfides may have become excited, resulting in her glow under the right conditions of UV light, but ultimately no sure answer was found. While this might sound bizarre at first, I did manage to find this article on the Guardian website about how humans can produce bioluminescence as a result of the chemical reactions constantly going on inside of our bodies. It is just so dim that our eyes are unable to see it. If this is the case, then it could be that Anna's body was in some sort of overdrive at times. As we can see in the data, her heart and respiratory rates go up when the glow was reported to have occurred, but this is just my own speculation, and I am in no way a doctor or a scientist. I was unable to find any similar cases of another person glowing like Anna, which makes me wonder, could this have simply been a case of bioluminescence, or could the glow have possibly been the result of something else? Boriska Kipriyonovich was a Russian boy born on January 11, 1996. From a young age, his parents noticed that he was incredibly smart, and he would take the world by storm by claiming that he was actually from the planet Mars. Quoted in an interview done by Andrei Mikhailov, Boriska's mother would state this: "When Boris was just 1 year old, I started giving him letters, and guess what? At 1.5, he was able to read large newspaper print. It didn't take him long to get acquainted with colors and their shades. He began to paint that too." In a separate quote, "No one has ever taught him that," recalls Nadia, "but sometimes he would sit in a lotus position and start all these talks. He would talk about Mars, about planetary systems, distant civilizations. We couldn't believe our ears. Cosmos, never-ending stories of other worlds and the immense skies are like daily mantras for him since he was 2. And it was around the time that he turned 11 that word of the boy from Mars began to spread. While this might be something you would expect from a young child, it was the way that Boriska spoke about it. It seemed to not come from his imagination, but more as if he was speaking through his memories. He claimed he was a descendant of the Lemurian civilization, a civilization that used to live and thrive on Mars, but fell into catastrophe, forcing those who survived to migrate underground. He spoke of other civilizations as well, and even claimed that he would travel through the cosmos while piloting a spacecraft. And according to Boriska, there were more children like him being born, which he called the Special Ones. He believed that something was set to occur on planet Earth that would change everything and force humans to change their mentality. Another term given to these children is indigo children. The name was first coined in the 1970s by a woman named Nancy Ann Tappe. She was a parapsychologist, or someone who studies psychic phenomenon. Nancy claimed that in her studies she began to notice more children being born with indigo auras. These children were believed to have been gifted with high intelligence, and in some cases, even possessed extrasensory abilities. But much of this was sensationalized, and there isn't proof that these indigo children really exist. In his 2017 interview, Boriska came out to announce that his mission was to warn the Earth of the impending destruction that would be brought upon the planet as a result of a nuclear apocalypse. He stated that the Special Ones, or indigo children, were the results of Martian beings with supernatural abilities being born into human bodies. He also claimed that there would be a catastrophe in 2009 and another one in 2013. Interestingly enough, back in 2009, A 7.6 magnitude earthquake did take the lives of over 1,100 people in Indonesia. However, 2013 was a relatively tame year in terms of major disasters. He also predicted that the Earth's magnetic poles were soon going to flip. According to NASA, the Earth's magnetic poles flip in a cycle, and many scientists believe that the next cycle is long overdue. This isn't some hidden information, and of course Boriska could have found it, but what amazed people was the confidence that he spoke with. It was not as if he was just repeating something he read somewhere. It was as if he studied this his whole life and really knew what he was talking about, or at least sounded like it. Today, at the time of this recording, Boriska would be about 28 years old, and he does not appear to have any social media of any kind, according to some sources, though I wouldn't necessarily call them reliable. He was taken into custody by the Russian government and is living under their protection in a remote village. Whether this was to escape the media attention or aid the government is debated, but others say that his story was simply found to be a hoax, and that he stays off of the internet to avoid backlash. One thing is certain, and it is that since he was very young, he was very intelligent. But whether or not he really is a reborn Lemurian from the planet Mars remains a mystery. Rome is one of the most famous cities on the planet, known for its architecture, rich history, and art that continues to amaze us centuries later. But what if I told you that Rome may have a secret name? One that was so secret that mention of it could have gotten you executed. Such would allegedly be the case of a man named Quintus Valerius Soranus. In the year 82 BC, he was a Roman elite whose social circles contained that of scholars and politicians, but in that year, he was ordered to be executed for revealing the secret name of Rome. I tried to look for evidence of Rome even having a secret name to begin with, and as you might guess, there was little to no information, but I did manage to find a few possible explanations. The first one being that the secret name of Rome is Amor, or Roma backwards. This is because of the city's dedication to the Roman goddess of love, Venus, though I believe that this is a bit too simple to really be a name so secret that mentioning it would get you executed. There's also this translated version of the Roman book titled Natural History, written by a man named Pliny the Elder, who died back in 79 AD. In this section of one of the books, he mentions Quintus's execution. Rome itself, whose other name it is held to be a sin to utter, except at the ceremonies of the mysteries, and when Valerius Soranus divulged the secret religiously kept for the weal of the state, he soon paid the penalty. The ceremony of the mysteries is the part that I would like to focus on. Religion seems to play a big part in Rome's secret name, and one of their beliefs was that every city had a protective deity, a god or goddess. There is also a Roman military ritual called an evocatio that was performed in order to lure away a city's protective deity by calling upon its true name. This could have been what Quintus revealed, and if this was the belief at the time, then we could see why he was punished. But what was the name that he revealed? In this article, the author pieced together what they could in an effort to uncover this secret name, and it starts with an ancient tribe from southern Italy who go by the name Hirpini. Their lineage traces back to the founding of Rome, and according to their legends, it was a wolf that led them to Rome where they established their first settlements, and on Mount Socrates they had a temple where they would hold ritual firewalks. Here, priests would be tested by walking on hot coals. The author believes that Quintus was closely associated with the Hirpini, and that it was during one of these rituals that he had uttered the secret name. But in order to uncover this, we have to dive in deeper into the founding of Rome. This brings us to the legend of Romulus and Remus. They were born from the wife of King Amulius of Alba Longa. Because the two brothers could threaten the king's rule, he threw them into the Tiber River. It was here that the god Tiberinus saved them and eventually carried them back to the place that would soon become Rome. One of the most depicted parts of this story is that of the twins suckling from a she-wolf who had found them and took care of them until a shepherd found the boys and raised them as his own. In some ways, the wolf could be seen as the mother of Rome. Now let's go back to the Hirpini. Their name comes from the Oscan word hirpes, or wolf, and the priests who performed the firewalk were called the Hirpi Sorani, or the Wolves of Soranes. As I said earlier, the legend was that the Hirpini were led to their first settlements by a wolf, so we can see the significance of the wolf in the early founding of Rome. The Hirpi Sonari have also been called the Cult of the Wolf. Given this information, the author concludes that the secret name of Rome must have been Hirpa, or some variant of their wolf goddess. They also believe that Quintus must have been one of these priests, which is how he had knowledge of their secret wolf goddess name, eventually going on to speak it out loud during one of these rituals, resulting in his execution. But there is one final possibility to what the secret name is that I saw in a post from a now deleted Redditor. The blog post linked here cites a lot of antiquated scholarship. Nobody knows the secret name of Rome because it never had one. At least not until people in the late Republic began speculating about archaic and obsolete ceremonies and literary fabrications that passed for history. You'll notice that the passages cited link a secret name of Rome to the idea of evocatio, the religious ceremony whereby the Romans supposedly lured the deity of an enemy city to defect to them. By that logic, the legalistic Roman concludes, if the enemy doesn't know the real name of our city, then they can't convince our deity to defect. Far from being a usual practice, there are practically no solid historical examples of evocatio from early Rome. You have Lily's legendary origin story in the capture of Veii, and the anachronistic revival of this ceremony, supposedly prior to the destruction of Carthage. Another thing, the attested formula for the ritual begins, whether god or goddess. In other words, the name of the god is irrelevant. Even at Veii, the Romans supposedly summoned Juno Regina, not some eponymous civic god. If Hannibal wanted to evoke the god of Rome, he undoubtedly targeted Jupiter Optimus Maximus, not Roma, let alone secret Roma. You can read what we know about Valerius Sonatus at Wiki, including the giant mess caused by Varro's weird claim that he was killed for uttering the secret name, and not because he made enemies during Sulla's proscription like everyone else. In sum, the secret name of Rome and supposedly routine evocatio are two of those antiquarian puzzles that seemed very important to excitable positivist scholars in the 19th century, but hardly hold up to serious scrutiny. Maybe some folks at the end of the Republic hit on the idea to explain other things, and if they presumably believed in it, I guess that they made it real. But remember, we're not talking about what people in the age of Cicero thought was archaic and authentic, not whatever really happened centuries later, for which we have no reliable sources. And I believe that this commenter has a really good point. Sulla's proscriptions were a campaign by the Roman proconsul and later dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, in which he eliminated his enemies in the aftermath of his victory in the Civil War of 83 through 82 BC. This timeline lines up very well with Quintus's execution, and if he was one of these priests in this wolf cult, then we could see why Sulla would want to get rid of him. Perhaps the utterance of the secret name was merely an excuse to get rid of a political opponent, but as the commenter said, without reliable historical sources, it's almost impossible to confirm. If there was a secret name, I believe that some variant of a wolf goddess would make more sense than Amor, given the wolf's symbolism in the founding of Rome. Still, it all seems as though we are grasping at straws, but I guess that's why they call it a secret. That's all for this video. If you made it this far, leave a like, and as always, thanks for watching.